Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video from Amar Talks NRL SuperCoach. Today we're wrapping up the position profiles by taking a look at the number ones, the all-important fullback spot. So if you guys do enjoy the video, really appreciate a thumbs up. Do please consider subscribing to the channel as well if you are enjoying the content. Let's get straight into it. So as you can see in the table, the fullback position is one of the most important positions in my opinion for SuperCoach. Consistently ranks in the top 20 for averaging players, very consistently as well in the top point scorers. Just given the high involvement of fullbacks in the actual NRL, that really does translate to SuperCoach. You know, they take a lot of run meters, so the base points are pretty good, but they're always involved in setting up tries, scoring tries. A few of these fullbacks are also goal kickers, so they just are able to accumulate points in a variety of ways, which is why they're so good for the SuperCoach. And in terms of squad structure, I really don't think fullback is a spot that you should be running any cheapies, given how high of an upside position it is and how good it is for point scoring. Really do think it is a position that you need to prioritize having two gun spots in there. We had 6 fullbacks in the top 20 averaging in 2022 and 2021, and 5 in 2020, and a few players who've made this list a few times. Ryan Papenhuyzen had a tremendous 2022 when he was available at fit and firing. Unfortunately, he's probably not going to be an option for us to begin the season. James Tedesco has featured very high over the last 3 seasons as well, just a very consistent gun that you can normally rely on, both for high upside, but also just to play a lot of games. He's a very durable option. We saw Latrell Mitchell have a fantastic back end of 2022, had a pretty good 2021 season as well. One thing I should also mention with 2021 is that was probably an outlier in terms of high point scoring. You know, you see Tom Trbojevic with a 143 average in 2021. I don't expect that to get replicated ever again, but it does show that he is obviously a really good SuperCoach option when he is fit and firing. But I think what this table shows you is that there's a lot of players who consistently feature on this list. It is a high scoring position. Tedesco and Gutherson were the only 2 players actually to feature in the top 20 for point scoring, but that is also because players like Tom Trbojevic, Papenhuyzen, Latrell, they missed quite a few games. It's just that when they did play, their averages tended to be higher. But overall, I do think it's a position that you really need to be targeting 2 guns in my opinion. So taking a look at the gun category of fullbacks, quickly talking about Ryan Papenhuyzen. So the Storm have released an update that mentions that Papenhuyzen is likely to be out for at least the first 8 rounds of the season. So really shouldn't be an option at all. That ownership of 1.6% should be 0. Absolutely no reason to be having him at 950k to begin the year. For me, the 3 guns that I think a lot of people are deliberating on is Latrell Mitchell, James Tedesco, and Tom Trbojevic. Now, Latrell obviously had a fantastic back end of last season. The next slide, I've actually got a few more stats around averages against the top 8 and the bottom 8. But Latrell's average against anyone last season was tremendous. He finished with an 84.5 point average. It was very consistent as well. 71% of the time he scored over 60 and really had the ceiling. 29% of games he also scored over 100. And that really does come down to the fact that he was goal kicking as well. If you look at the stats below me, you know, Pappy and Latrell kind of similar vein, where really the base stats aren't their bread and butter. The fact that they goal kick and they set up the tries, is particularly for Latrell, is really where they do get the points. We even saw it in the Indigenous All-Stars game. Latrell was able to throw quite a few nice passes for Cobbo. Unfortunately, Cobbo dropped the ball a couple of times, but you know, that kind of gave you the indication of what Latrell can do. And we really saw at the back end of last season him kind of be the focal point of the attack and setting up a lot of his wingers for tries. So I think that, plus the fact that he's goal kicking in a pretty settled Rabbitohs side, makes him a really appealing option to begin the season. Kind of a pod as well, 14% ownership. The obvious con with Latrell is the fact that he's got a pretty difficult draw. You know, Sharks and Penrith away in the first 2 rounds, and then the Roosters away in round 3, followed up by Manly and Melbourne before the Bulldogs in round 6, who may be an improved team as well this season. So overall, you look at that run of games and think that's quite tough. We'll get onto it as well on the next slide, but Latrell's average against top opposition last season, it didn't really matter. He still averaged over 80. So there's a very easy argument to say that he's just going to replicate it. Personally, I'm probably not going to start with Latrell unless we find out that Tom Trbojevic is not available for round 1. That might make me rethink and start with him. I just feel that at the beginning of the season, yes, Rabbitohs are a settled side, but I think at the beginning of the season, and look, there's not much for me to go on. I might have to dig out some numbers to validate this, but I feel like team attacks are not going to be fully clicking in the first opening rounds. That kind of will develop, in my opinion, you know, midway towards the back end of the season, which is exactly what we saw with the Rabbitohs. Tough draw, it didn't matter. They had all their rep and origin players back, fully healthy side, and they were fully clicking. I'm just not sure if we're going to quite see that maybe at the beginning of the season. I think you can argue it can happen for Rabbitohs because their team is overall pretty settled. But my feeling is that they're not going to be as slick in attack as what they were probably at the back end of last season. And I think as a result, I do see Latrell regressing slightly from that 84.5 average. So I do think he isn't probably the best value to begin the season. If I were to guess, I might think his average is probably around the 75 to 80. Like, I don't see it being a significant drop off. I just think the potential that their attack isn't quite as slick to begin the season, coupled with a tough draw, makes me lean away from Latrell. But as I mentioned, if Turbo is not fit for round one, there's a very good chance that I just start with Latrell and Tedesco as a combo, just knowing that Latrell is a premium option. He's very expensive, obviously, at 889k, but I think he can be close to matching that this season. I'm just going to take the gamble that I don't think he'll do it at the beginning of the season. Now, moving on to Tedesco, he's very clearly the most popular fullback, and the most popular fullback combo is Tedesco and Trbojevic, just looking at these ownership stats. Tedesco is currently in my side, and he's probably going to stay there, I think, for round one. You know, the first two games are really good. Dolphins away and Warriors at home. Does get a bit trickier for the Roosters, you know, Rabbitohs, and then you've got a bye early on in round four, followed on by Parramatta and then Melbourne. So Tedesco's average in terms of against the top 8 and the bottom 8 is pretty consistent. He tends to be that kind of, well, steady 80 sounds odd to say with Tedesco, but because he's got pretty good base stats, you can see below me at 31, and he gets more points from tackle breaks compared to someone like Latrell. Generally, his floor is going to be higher. The fact that he doesn't goal kick probably means his ceiling isn't going to be quite as high as Latrell. If you look at the numbers to the left of me, 17% of the times he scored over 100, so has a ceiling, but just didn't show it as much as Latrell. But I think for the fact that he's got those really two nice games to start the season, like round one, I can definitely see him being a prime captaincy option. The fact that his ownership is also creeping up, it's getting around 43%. That's a lot of players that you'd be kind of anti-potting if you weren't starting with Tedesco. So there is a bit of a FOMO element to that as well. I think the biggest con with Teddy is the fact that he's got a bye early on in round four. But I think even more so with Tedesco is potential concussion issues. You know, NRL Physio has mentioned this in his excellent injury profiles, but Tedesco has had quite a few concussions over the past few seasons. Now, it's a bit of a difficult one to say as a con because there's no predicting when the next concussion can happen. All it will mean is that if Tedesco was to get a concussion, for example, there's a increased risk that he's going to miss more games. I think at that point, you probably just take the risk and that, look, if he gets a concussion and he's out for a few weeks, he's at a price tag where you can very easily move up to someone like Latrell, or you've got a few options below him that you can trade down to. So for me, yes, it's definitely a con and a definite risk, but I'm willing to take that gamble just with the knowledge that he's got two really good games in the first opening rounds, and he's just one of the most consistent Supercoach options we've seen over the past few seasons. You kind of know what you're going to get. Very good chance as well he'll be my captain in round one. So I personally am going to start with Tedesco. A lot of other coaches agree with that as well. And I do think he's probably one of the top 3 fullbacks, I think, to select from your round one teams. Now, moving on to a few more pod options, the like of Drinkwater, Gutherson, Dylan Edwards, and AJ Brimson. Of these 4, Drinkwater is probably the one I've had the most consideration for, and that's mainly because of the Cowboys draw. I've mentioned a few times when talking about Val Holmes in the center video, the Cowboys draw is excellent. They've probably got the best draw over the first 8 weeks of the season. They don't have a bye until round 15, so you really can plug in someone like a Drinkwater and hold on to him for quite a long time. So at 746k, you are picking him up at probably what was a career breakout year for him, you know, a 71 average. The thing with Drinkwater was he did show his ceiling, 20% of the time scored over 100, but he tended to be a bit more volatile. So 36% of the time he scored over 60. You know, you compare that to Teddy and Mitchell, 70% that they scored over 60. So you're not going to get that consistency, I think, with Drinkwater. If you look at the stats below me, he was more reliant on getting those kind of try assists. He doesn't goal kick, would expect Val Holmes to be goal kicking. So that's probably something, again, that works against him. So I think if you are going to go for a pod fullback with, say, sub 10% ownership, Drinkwater is probably who I would opt for, mainly because of the Cowboys draw. They're also a very settled side, so I think you can fairly expect that they're going to come out of the blocks pretty well to start the season, and Drinkwater was a massive part of their success last year as well. So I do like him as a pod. I'm probably just leaning towards going with Teddy as a more kind of rock solid option, who I know historically has done it over a few seasons. Drinkwater's had probably this one season where he's done very well, so he doesn't have that pedigree that someone like Tedesco has. So that's why at the moment I'm leaning away from Drinkwater, but he probably would be the pod fullback I would go for if you are looking to start with a low ownership fullback for round one. Now, Clint Gutherson, look, he's a really solid option. We saw him in that table at the beginning of the video. He has featured in the past few seasons in the top 20 averaging fullbacks. At times he does show a ceiling, but that's mainly when he's goal kicking, when Mitchell Moses is not playing. when Moses is playing, Gutherson for me doesn't really appeal. He's more of your very consistent option. 48% of the time scored over 60, but only 8% of the time he scored over 100. And I think when you're looking at, he's over 700,000, so he's not necessarily cheap. You're probably wanting from your fullback more 100 plus point games, or just kind of those higher upside games, I think, given that you've got the likes of Tedesco, Latrell, even Turbo to an extent can knock out those scores. Combining that with the fact that Parramatta have got a pretty tough run as well to begin the season, I do think Gutherson is probably worth avoiding for the start of the season. But I've mentioned the same thing with Dylan Brown and Mitch Moses. When we've got more of an emphasis on bye planning, really like Gutherson maybe from round 6, because Parramatta are really good for the major bye weeks during the season because they play in all of the major bye rounds. So for me, he's one that I think is going to be interesting, but probably not for me to start the season. I just don't think he's got that upside and ceiling of Teddy or Latrell. Dylan Edwards had a really good 2022 season as well, rock solid. We'll get onto it in the next slide as well, but his average against top 8 and bottom 8 really didn't change that much because he's got such good base stats. If you look below me, a base stat average of 36 is pretty insane, and so he's never going to give you a bad score. He's probably most weeks going to get you the 50 to 55, if not 60. I can very comfortably think that Edwards will probably get around the mid to say 65 to 67, 68 average of this season. I think he just seems to be a player who's growing and getting better with every season. But again, lacks that upside I think that I'd probably want in my fullback. 5% of the games he played last year, he scored over 100, which is much less than some of these other fullbacks. So really like Edwards, but again, a counter is that he has a bye in round 3. If you're already looking at starting with Cleary, maybe Brian Tu'o, maybe someone like a Luke Garner, I think you are taking a bit more of a risk there by also adding in someone like Dylan Edwards. So I don't think he's going to be a bad option for you. He's not going to do anything wrong for you. Early bye probably doesn't help, and you can probably take that risk a bit more with the Tedesco of an early bye because Teddy's got that ceiling and can very easily do well in the first 2 weeks. Panthers' first 2 games, Broncos and Rabbitohs, not the easiest on paper. So again, I think there's a couple of cons against Edwards which would make me want to avoid starting with him in round 1. I talked about AJ Brimson in my 5-8 video, so if you haven't checked that out, I'll leave a link for the description below. But just to kind of quickly summarize, oddly enough, Brimson's stats when he actually played at fullback last year were worse than when he played at 5'8". I do think he is much more suited though to the fullback position, so I think that sample size from last year was a bit of a small one, so I wouldn't really take too much into account there. He did really well at the back end of 2020 when he was playing at fullback, and I think that's much more representative of what the potential is for AJ Brimson. The Titans draw is not too bad. You got Tigers and Dragons in the first 2 weeks, then does go into Melbourne, Cowboys, and then a bye. After that, round 6 onwards, it is pretty good. So what I'm thinking of doing is probably not going to start with Brimson because, again, upside-wise, it wasn't quite matching the likes of Teddy or Latrell. But I think if you can see how the Titans are performing in the first 5 weeks, from round 6 onwards, the Titans draw does open up a little bit. And I think at that point, I probably would like to go with maybe a Brimson at that point if he does look like he's representing value and could be a pod at that stage. But I think you don't need to take that gamble necessarily in round 1. Now, Tom Trbojevic, there was a couple of questions about Tom, about his fitness, how he's looking to come back for the start of the season. The latest news on Tom Trbojevic is that he's mentioned that he should be ready to go for round 1. And so there was some talk earlier in the preseason that if he was coming back, he may start in the centres. That's kind of been quashed, and it's expected that if he's fit for round 1, he will be lining up at fullback. Now, it's a pretty good game in round 1 with Bulldogs at home. The early bye in round 2 is a little bit frustrating because that means very early on you're going to have to manage, if you've got a Teddy and Turbo combination, you're going to have your 2 gun fullbacks miss 2 games pretty early on in the opening month. So that is a bit of a con. It's just very hard to not start with Turbo if you know that he's fit in round 1. Obviously, he had a bit of a small sample size of games in 2022 because he missed quite a bit with injury, but we all know how good and quality of a player he is. He does have that SuperCoach pedigree. In 2019, he had an average of 77, and 2020, he had a 67. 2021, 143, but obviously that's a big outlier. But we've seen even prior to that outlier year, Turbo go close to averaging around a 70, and you're picking him up at 577k, which is like a low 60s average. So immediately you can see the value there. We all know how integral he is to Manly. Really good base stats as well, so we know that he's probably going to have quite a good floor and is not going to get you any bad scores. Now, obviously the biggest thing with Tom is his hamstring injuries, and again I have to give a shout out to NRL Physio's injury profiles, which are just absolutely excellent. does a very comprehensive breakdown of Tom's issues and injuries over the past few seasons. He does mention that there is obviously still a risk with Turbo and his hamstrings coming into round 1, but he's getting the same treatment that Latrell got over in the US, and we all saw how good Latrell returned once he had kind of gone over and come back. Hopefully, fingers crossed, the same thing happens for Turbo, because I think as just an NRL fan, we all love to see Tom Trbojevic in full flight. And I think there's obviously going to be a risk of a future hamstring injury with Turbo, just given the history. But the difference is, I think that when you're only going to pay $577,000, I think there's enough upside and reward for the low cost that you're paying to go with him if he is fit in round 1. If Turbo is not available for round 1, I don't see any reason to start with him, because then you're looking at round 1, round 2 he's going to miss straight away, and then he goes into Parramatta and then the Rabbitohs. At that point, I think you can afford to wait. In that case, I'd probably then look to go, if I was starting with Tedesco and Turbo, I'd probably try to look for Turbo and get some extra cash to move up to, say, like a Drinkwater or Latrell. Personally, I might take a pod choice in Drinkwater just for the fact that he's low owned but has got the good draw. But I think Turbo being fit in round 1, just knowing the pedigree of the player, it would make it very difficult to not start with him. Hence why 31.7% of coaches are starting with him. If he's fit for round 1, he'll be there for me too as well. Very likely my fullback combination will be Turbo and Teddy. I also just wanted to quickly present this slide as well, just taking a bit more of an extended view looking at your fullbacks, because we do see someone like Tedesco and Turbo do have buys fairly early on in the draw. And so you guys know me, I love doing my numbers and I love doing my maths, so I wanted to put some numbers behind potential expected points. Now, big pinch of salt with this one. If you look at the table below me of averages versus the top 8 and the bottom 8, you can see Latrell's averages are insanely high against the bottom 8. This is only a sample size of 3 games. There was one game he played against the Dragons, but he only played 14 minutes, so I'm discounting that one. So there's only the 3 games where he played 80 minutes against bottom 3, and that was 93 versus the Knights, 136 versus the Bulldogs, and 152 against the Warriors. So pretty big scores. So realistically, I don't think he would match 127 average against the bottom 8 if you're looking at a longer term basis. What's probably most impressive with Latrell is that 82 average against the top 8. But as I mentioned earlier, most of those games were in the back end of the season after round 16 when he returned. And we just saw how seamlessly he fit into that Rabbitohs team. I just wonder if that's going to get replicated. And so let's say if I was to even notch back that average by, say, 75 points, and let's say his bottom 8 average is, say, 85, you're looking at an average of about 80. So pretty close to what he's priced at. But I do think that you're slightly unders. I mean, look, if he gets an 80 average over the first 13 weeks, you'd probably take that. That will then reduce his expected points to about 1,000, which is still higher than someone like Tedesco, who's I've got predicted at about 880, just looking purely at averages. And the reason for that is obviously that Latrell doesn't have any buys in the first 13 weeks, which is definitely a plus in his favor. So if you're kind of 50-50 on Latrell Tedesco, maybe that is one thing that you can consider, is that yes, the opening few rounds are tough for the Rabbitohs, but if you look at from round 6 onwards, it does definitely get a little bit better, and there's no buys that you have to worry about. So you can pretty much hold Latrell all the way up until the State of Origin period. So I think if you're looking for a more set and forget, and you really don't want to, say, use any trades in your fullback, and you want maybe a good long-term hold, maybe Latrell is the better option. I'm personally going with Tedesco though. I just prefer his early draw, and I think we can use the trades in round 13 to then flip Teddy to maybe someone like a Clint Gutherson, who will maybe be better coverage during the Origin period, or maybe someone to say like a Dylan Edwards. That's one thing that I'm thinking about. But I think what this table also shows is that Drinkwater, if he is able to replicate those numbers from last season, that draw really does work in his favor. I mean, if you look at it all the way up until round 8, there's really no big tough opposition in there. It's not until round 9 when they verse the Sharks away, and there's lots of home games for the Cowboys, which is where they really excelled last season. So if you're looking at purely from last season's averages against bottom 8 and top 8, Drinkwater could even get close to matching someone like a Trell, 950 points. Mitchell could be someone like 1,000 if you do those discounts to the averages that I mentioned, and could even outperform someone like a Tedesco. So it is something that's worth thinking about. Gutherson actually had a pretty solid average against both top 8 and also bottom 8. So you could look at that and think he's going to be a pretty steady option. But for me, it probably then comes to that point of upside and ceiling, which is where, again, I prefer someone like Latrell, Tedesco. Even someone like Drinkwater had more 100-point games than Gutherson. So I think Gutherson's, while his expected points are okay, I'd probably take that with a bit of a pinch of salt. Obviously the Eels probably aren't as strong on paper. The fact that they've lost Reid Marnie, and also that they've lost Isaiah Papali'i. So there's a few changes there in the Eels that might make them overall a weaker squad. So you can also use that as a bit of a con against Gutherson. Dylan Edwards and Brimson are kind of in the similar category around the mid 700 points, as is Turbo. I guess the difference with Turbo is that if you look at his averages against bottom 8, it was 56 last season, very small sample size. I think you can probably expect that it could easily get back up to say 65, at which point you're all of a sudden looking at expected points which are over 750, getting closer towards 800, and we definitely know that there's room for that to grow, and you're also getting at less than 600k. That's kind of why I'm looking at Turbo and thinking he's probably going to be someone I'm going to want for the long term. For me, Turbo, Teddy, they're still the two guys that I'm looking at starting with for round 1. Now, I do want to touch on a couple of mid-range / value options that I had a few questions about. There were actually a lot of questions about Xavier Savage, but since those questions have come in, it has been confirmed now that he's got a fractured or broken jaw, which is obviously a terrible injury, and it looks like he's going to be out for the first 4 to 5 weeks, which is why I've actually put in Jordan Rapana here. I know Rapana isn't a fullback in SuperCoach, you can only get him in the centers, but I thought it might be worthwhile touching on Rapana briefly. Playing at fullback over the last 2 seasons, Rapana's average playing at fullback is 63 points, and those stats that I've got below me reflect his fullback numbers. Generally what happens when he plays at fullback is his base stats go up a little bit more, so he's more likely to get you your solid kind of 45 to 50s. He's not going to be goal kicking, that's probably the only downside. Jamal Fogarty is probably still going to be goal kicking for the Raiders, so I think if you're looking for a budget center wing option, because I didn't talk about Rapana in my center wing video, he could be an option now that he plays the first 4 or 5 weeks at fullback. Only issue is that the draw is kind of up and down in that period. Yes, they've got the Dolphins and the Knights, but they've also got Cowboys away, Sharks and Penrith in the first 5 weeks. So that draw doesn't scream like, yes, you can take a good punt on Rapana and it's going to get immediate reward. So for me, Rapana, I probably still wouldn't advise it, even though his numbers do look a bit better playing at fullback. But Reece Walsh and Kalen Ponga, 2 pretty interesting options. I personally haven't considered Walsh too much. I know he had a very good performance in the trials. He has picked up like an eye socket fracture, but all reports are that he should still be okay for round 1. Issue with Walsh though is that he's not going to be goal kicking. He was goal kicking for the Warriors, so if I look at those stats below me, the scoring average of 9 points may stay about the same, or it may even reduce. You are obviously getting him at a pretty cheap price of 555k, and one thing with the Broncos, their draw is really good from round 3 onwards. My only counter is that I just see Tom Trbojevic for like 20k more expensive, much more proven gun. Broncos probably going to be okay this season. They may be fighting for the top 8, but they kind of fell away at the back end of last season. And I think the fact that he's lost the goal kicking, it just means for 20,000 more, I'd probably just opt for Turbo, but definitely a nice pod option that you can maybe take a punt on because the draw is really good from round 3. But I'd personally just say if Turbo's fit round 1, just go with him. He's the much more known quantity. Kalen Ponga is a real interesting one. The reports are that KP, if he is fit in round 1 and is playing, he's probably first choice for goal kicking, which is obviously a big tick for SuperCoach because we do like goal kickers. It just really gives them a nice floor. And the Knights have got a really good draw as well. If you look at rounds 1 to 6, New Zealand, Tigers, Dolphins, Canberra, Manly, Warriors, pretty good draw for the first 6 weeks. It does get a little bit tougher from there, but they don't play their first bye until round 10, so you're going to be able to hold someone like a KP for a pretty extended period of time. Now, personally, I don't think I would be starting with Ponga in my fullback. I just think Turbo offers too good value, and I think I'd rather just pay the premium to pair up Turbo with someone like a Latrell or a Tedesco. I think Ponga, though, if he is dual listed, apparently the game are looking to still add dual position players before round 1 starts. Now, if Ponga, look, he's been named in the number 6 for the trials this week. If he gets dual listing at 5'8", definitely serious consideration to start with Ponga, I think, as a backup 5'8". I don't think I'd be putting him in my fullback. I just think there's too many other good options. But at 5'8", it does make it very interesting. You potentially run like a Matt Burton-Ponga combination and move someone like a Josh Schuster to your second row forward. But now, obviously, one of the biggest risks with Ponga is the concussion history, given that he had so many concussions, unfortunately, in 2022 that put him out of action for a while. Now, I think the big question is, playing at 5'8", he's more likely to be in the defensive line. Is that actually a greater risk for him to cop more concussions? Now again, shout out to NRL Physio and his magnificent injury profiles. I'll let you go dig into his injury profiles because I think it's 100% worth purchasing for the $10 or joining as his Patreon. Basically what he says is that fullback is one of the most dangerous spots in terms of getting concussions, whereas 5'8" is actually one of the most safest spots, statistically speaking, in terms of number of concussions over the past 2 seasons. I won't get into much more than that, but I think that's a pretty useful golden piece of information that Physio's got in his injury profiles. So I think if you do have some doubts about starting with Ponga because he's going to be making more tackles, you've got the best in the business saying that he's probably going to actually be safer in terms of concussions playing at 5'8". So that does make me more willing to then take the punt on Ponga if he does start in round 1 and is confirmed to be goal kicking. But as I mentioned, I think I would be trying to get him in my 5'8 spot. And just to kind of wrap things up, I'm not going to be going into any kind of cheapies in this particular video because, as I mentioned at the beginning, I do personally think it is a risk to not go with 2 gun or at least 1 gun and a mid-range option at fullback. I would lean towards just going with the 2 guns. But I think running a cheapie in your fullback spot when you've only got 2 spots as well, if, for example, if you're starting with someone like Tedesco, he's got to buy in round 4, you've got to be sure then that your cheapie is going to actually play in round 4. Other people are going to have the likes of Drinkwater, Latrell, Turbo, maybe a Dylan Edwards. They're all going to get pretty good points. So I personally don't think it's worth running a cheapie in your fullback spot. Definitely think it's worth paying up the premium for 2 guns, or at least maybe trying to go a little bit cheaper with someone like a Ponga or a Reece Walsh paired up with another gun. Well, that's it, guys. That is my fullback position breakdown heading into round 1 of the NRL season. If you guys enjoyed it, really do appreciate a thumbs up. Do please leave any comments below about fullbacks that you're considering or any other questions that you may have. And I'll see you all in the next video.